Her name is Rosalind Ashworth, 28 years old. 7 years working nights in the intensive care unit at St. Augustine Hospital in South Philadelphia. She knows the exact sound a monitor makes 3 seconds before a heart gives out. She knows how to hold a stranger's hand so they don't have to leave this world alone at 4 a.m. But in 28 years, she had never once known who was keeping watch over her. 13 months ago, her husband divorced her. 6 months before that, he had already started telling his own version that his wife wasn't steady enough, that she was the one who let go first. He told it to colleagues in the physician's lounge. He told it at the Marion Club on Saturday afternoons. He told it to the very nun who had known her since she was 19. What he didn't know was that she would find out exactly what he said, and exactly when. So when he called and told her he wanted to buy her dinner, just to close things out properly, and that he had someone he wanted her to meet call it an apology, she understood immediately that it wasn't a dinner at all. It was a stage. What nobody in that room knew, including her, was that the man who walked through the door that night was not the man who had been invited. He came in someone else's place. He had known her name for 18 months, and he had spent that entire afternoon sitting in a car on the corner of Walnut Street, telling himself he wasn't going to say a single word. If you've ever been made into someone's punchline by the one person you trusted most, leave a like, so I know you're here with this story. Share it with someone who's been carrying more than they've ever said out loud, and subscribe with the notification bell on, because the best part of this story is still ahead of us. Mr. Hollis in bed number 7 passed away at 4:10 in the morning, and no one came to claim him. He was 81 years old and had been admitted 19 days earlier with pneumonia. The space for next of kin in his file had been left blank. Rosalind Ashworth remained beside his bed for 40 minutes after everything was over, her hands resting in her lap, doing nothing at all. The machines had been turned off. The only sounds left in the room were the hum of the air conditioner and the wheels of carts rolling through the hallway outside. She didn't pray, because she wasn't sure she still remembered how. She simply sat there so he wouldn't have to be alone for another 40 minutes. Then she stood, finished the shift handoff sheet, and went to wash her hands. By 7 o'clock in the morning, when the day shift began pouring in with the smell of coffee and the voices of people who had gotten enough sleep, Rosie had been working for 12 hours straight, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything. Yvette Marchetti, the head nurse on the day shift, placed a cup of coffee in front of her in the break room and sat down in the chair across from her with the expression of someone about to say something she'd been weighing for an entire week. "You're really going, aren't you?" Yvette said. It wasn't a question. Rosie looked down at the coffee. "He said his mother wants to talk about Wesley." Yvette breathed out through her nose. "And you believe him?" "I don't believe him, but I don't dare not go." Beyond the glass door of the break room, 2 residents walked past. One of them glanced inside, then looked away too quickly, and Rosie recognized the movement because she'd seen it around 15 times over the past 3 weeks. Yvette saw it too. "You know what's happening, don't you?" she said, her voice dropping low. "There's a report. It was submitted to the ethics committee 11 days ago. It accuses you of making a medication dosage error during the night shift on the 7th. Rosie set the coffee down. She'd heard the rumors the week before, fragments gathered in elevators and beside sinks, but no one had said it directly to her face, and she'd tried to convince herself that silence meant there was nothing there. "Who signed it?" Yvette shook her head. "They wouldn't let me see the name. I only know it exists. I wasn't working the night of the 7th. I was at Northfield with my brother." "Then that's good." "It isn't good," Rosie said, "because if someone has already written a piece of paper saying, 'I did it,' then someone already has a reason prepared to believe it. People don't write papers like that about someone they haven't already judged." Yvette had no answer. They both knew what a nursing license meant. To Rosie, it wasn't a piece of paper framed on a wall. It was $4,200 a month at Northfield Nursing Home, room 214, where a 24-year-old man who couldn't walk lived with no one else in the world to pay for his care. Losing her license wouldn't mean losing her job. Losing her license would mean her brother had to leave. She drove home to Fishtown shortly before 8 o'clock, through streets still wet with morning mist. And when she opened the apartment door, she stood motionless for several seconds in the dark hallway, like someone waiting to see whether a voice would call out. No one did. She hung up her coat, poured herself a glass of water, then, without understanding why, walked straight to the closet at the far end of the bedroom, the one she almost never opened. Inside, leaning behind several cardboard boxes, was a black violin case faded at the corners, Its latches rusted. A thin layer of dust spread evenly across its surface like old snow. It had been lying there for 6 years. Rosie placed her hand on the lid. She left it there longer than she'd intended. Long enough to feel the cold material warming beneath her palm. She didn't open it. She never opened it. There are things in a woman's life that aren't acts of courage when opened, only acts of cruelty against herself, and she'd learned how to tell the difference a long time ago. She drew her hand back, closed the closet door, and the click of the latch sounded louder in the empty apartment than it had any right to sound. She went into the kitchen, sat at the table, and looked through the window as Philadelphia slowly brightened into an ordinary Thursday. Then the phone on the tabletop began to vibrate, turning half a circle across the wood. She looked at the screen. 2 letters. C. B. 13 months earlier, she'd sat in that very chair and changed his name in her contacts to 2 initials because she couldn't bear seeing his full name light up in the darkness every time he called. She'd thought it would make him smaller. Sitting there at 8 o'clock in the morning, her hand trembling faintly against the tabletop, she understood that for 13 months she'd only been practicing how to look at a name without bleeding, and she still hadn't finished learning. She let the phone ring 4 times before answering, and she knew exactly what she was doing by allowing it to ring that long, because it was the only part of the conversation ahead that she could still control. Rosie. His voice was warm, rounded, and placed precisely where it needed to be, the voice he used when he sat on the edge of a patient's bed and told the family that the surgery had gone well. She'd heard it at home for 4 years, and it had taken her 3 of those years to understand that it wasn't his real voice, only a tool, sharpened with extraordinary care. "What do you want?" "I want to invite you to dinner, this Thursday. A place near Rittenhouse, private room." "No. Hear me out first." There was the rustle of paper behind him, then the sound of a pen tapping twice against a desk, his habit whenever he was reading from something he'd arranged in advance. "It's been 13 months, and every time I walk into the doctor's lounge, someone asks me what happened. That isn't good for me, and it isn't good for you either, whether you believe it or not. I think we should close this properly. Sit down for 1 meal. Let people see that 2 adults can share a table. And there's someone I want you to meet. A friend. Consider it an apology. No, Clayton. He's a good man. A little dull, but good. I think you need someone decent after me." He gave a soft laugh, a measured sound, and Rosie rose from her chair because she couldn't remain seated while listening to it. She'd been about to hang up. Her finger was already on the screen. Then he said, in the most ordinary voice imaginable, as though he'd only just remembered, "My mother wants to talk to you about Wesley." Rosie stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen. Outside the window, a garbage truck was backing up, its warning signal beeping at steady intervals. She could hear her own breathing. 4 years of marriage, and Clayton Whitfield Brenner had learned exactly which button to press. He'd learned it so thoroughly that he didn't need to emphasize the words or pause for breath. He only had to let them fall into the middle of the sentence like a dropped coin. 7 o'clock, he said. "I'll text you the address." Then he hung up first, which was another thing he always did. That afternoon, she drove out to Bala Sinwid. Northfield smelled like every long-term care facility in the world. Lemon disinfectant spread thinly over the smell of steamed food, and Rosie had grown so accustomed to it that she no longer noticed it at all. Room 214, the door partly open. Wesley Ashworth, 24 years old, sat in his wheelchair beside the window, with his laptop resting on the folding table. His hair longer than the hospital preferred, and he kept it that way for precisely that reason. "You're 20 minutes early," he said without turning around, "which means there's something you want to tell me that you don't want to tell me yet." "I brought cake." "You always bring cake when something's wrong," she told him. He listened to all of it without interrupting, his eyes still fixed on the screen, where an unfinished chess game waited. When she finished, he turned his wheelchair to face her. "Don't go. I have to." "No, you don't. You think you have to because he mentioned my name. That's the only reason you're going, and he knows it, and you know he knows it, and you're still going anyway." He didn't say it angrily, only wearily, and that was even harder to bear. "You're 28 years old, and you're still paying for an accident you didn't cause." "Don't say that." "Then what do you want me to say?" "I lie here, Rosie. I read books. I play chess with strangers at 3 o'clock in the morning because I can't sleep. That's everything I'm able to do." "And you're going to dinner with that bastard, so you can listen to his mother talk about me?" He fell silent for a while. then asked in a completely different voice, "Do you still have the violin?" Rosie looked through the window, where there was a bare tree and a parking lot. "No," she said. "I sold it a long time ago." He nodded, and he didn't believe her, and they both knew it, and neither of them wanted to push it any further. She stayed another hour, adjusted his blanket, argued with him about skipping lunch, then left. At 7 o'clock that evening, Wesley reopened his laptop. The game with Pivolkov 2-6 was still unfinished. Move number 19. His opponent waiting. He moved his queen, then typed into the chat box beside the board in the manner of someone speaking only to fill the silence, with no expectation that anyone would read closely. "Thursday night, my sister's having dinner with that bastard, and I'm lying here unable to do a thing." He pressed send and thought no more about it. He hadn't thought about it 3 weeks earlier either, on another sleepless night, when he'd typed, "I'm at Northfield, Balasinwid, room 214. Stop by sometime if you're free. I'm not going anywhere." Then shut down the computer and went to sleep, never knowing that on the other side of the chessboard, someone had read every word very carefully. Thursday night, Philadelphia was cold in the way it gets near the end of November, the kind of cold that doesn't bite but slips beneath your collar and stays there. Rosie wore the dark blue wool dress, the only respectable thing left in her closet, and stood before the mirror for 30 seconds before leaving home, not to see whether she looked beautiful, but to see whether she looked like someone who hadn't yet been defeated. Inside her coat pocket, her fingers touched a small plastic ring that had yellowed with age, and she left it there. The Rittenhouse Hotel smelled of freshly cut lilies and wool dampened by rain. A server led her to the second floor, and she could hear laughter coming from the private dining room before she reached the door. She stepped inside and did what she did every night when taking over a shift. She swept her gaze across the room and read each person the way she read a patient chart. Cordelia Brenner sat on the right in a cream cashmere sweater, one hand resting over the other, 66 years old, and in all 4 years she'd never once called Rosie by her first name, without placing a small pause before it. Preston Mahoney sat beside her, already halfway through a glass of wine. 2 residents Rosie knew only by sight were there as well, one of them named Dietrich something, sitting with his back straight the way young people always sat when invited to the table of someone above them, and in the middle sat Clayton, wearing a black turtleneck, his sleeves rolled exactly 1.5 turns, the way he always rolled them when he wanted to appear relaxed and deliberate at the same time. He rose to greet her and pulled out her chair. And during those 3 seconds, Rosie caught the scent of his cologne and realized that her body still remembered it, and she hated that more than anything else in the room. The chair to her left was empty. In front of it, leaning at an angle against the stem of a wineglass, was a name card printed in italic letters, "Gerald Fontaine. He'll be a few minutes late," Clayton said as he poured water for her, his voice generous, the voice of a man presenting someone with a gift. "Gerald works as a health insurance broker. We met through the hospital billing department." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "I'll be honest with you. He's a little dull, but he's kind. I think after me, you need someone kind." Preston laughed first, a short sound through his nose. Then the 2 residents laughed with him, while Cordelia Brenner smiled down into her glass of water, and Rosie understood at once, completely and fully, within the span of a single heartbeat. This wasn't a dinner meant to make peace. It was a joke, and she was the punchline. The night shift nurse, the woman who wasn't steady enough, paired with the dullest man in Philadelphia inside a private room at the Rittenhouse before 6 witnesses. This story would live in the doctor's lounge for at least 6 months. It would be repeated at the Marion Club on Saturday afternoons. And every time it was told, it would answer for Clayton the question people asked whenever he entered the doctor's lounge, without requiring him to say a single word. Rosie placed her hands in her lap beneath the table so no one could see them. She'd sat beside dying people and kept her face perfectly still for 7 years, so she kept it still now. She thanked the server when he poured her water. She asked Cordelia Brenner about her trip to Charleston. Cordelia answered in 4 polite sentences and didn't mention Wesley once. The clock on the wall read 9 minutes past 7. Rosie had already begun calculating how long she needed to remain seated before she could leave without turning herself into a new chapter in their story. At 12 minutes past 7, the private dining room door opened. The man who entered didn't search for a seat. That was the first thing Rosie noticed, because 7 years of watching people walk into hospital rooms had taught her that everyone hesitated for half a second at the threshold to locate themselves. This man didn't hesitate. He walked straight past 3 rows of chairs to the exact seat bearing Gerald Fontaine's name card, pulled it out, sat down, and turned the card face down on the table with 2 fingers. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, with black hair that had gone silver at the temples earlier than his age should have allowed, and an old watch with a worn leather strap. He looked around the table once, without hurry, then said in the most ordinary voice a person could use to say anything at all, "I'm taking Mr. Fontaine's place tonight. He sends his apologies." Clayton opened his mouth. Rosie saw his lips part and watched him draw in the breath needed to begin an entirely ordinary question, the question anyone hosting a dinner would have asked. Then he didn't ask it. He closed his mouth, reached for his glass of water, and took a sip he didn't need. And in that moment, Rosie realized something so strange that the hair rose along the back of her neck. All 10 people in that room had fallen silent at the exact same time, without planning it, without anyone signaling anyone else, and not one of them knew why they'd suddenly gone quiet. The silence lasted for about 4 seconds, then dissolved the way everything eventually dissolved in rooms where people had been taught to keep a meal moving smoothly. The server brought the bread. One of the 2 residents asked Clayton about Tuesday's surgery, and Clayton answered a little louder than necessary, the way a man does after missing a step on the stairs and wanting to prove that he is still walking normally. It was then that Cordelia Brenner turned to look at Rosie. Her gaze traveled slowly from Rosie's hair downward, pausing at the collar of her wool dress, lingering longer on her shoes, then moving away without a word. And Rosie knew exactly what that look meant, because she had endured it for 4 years at every Christmas party, every fundraiser, and every Sunday luncheon in Bryn Mawr. It was the look a mainline woman gave a dress bought from a discount store, and its cruelty lay in the fact that it came without words, leaving nothing to challenge, nothing to repeat to anyone later, nothing that existed except the knowledge that you had just been appraised and returned. Rosie lowered her eyes, lifted the napkin from her lap, and folded it in half across her knees. She did it only to give her hands something to do, and as she folded it, she murmured softly to herself, barely more than breath, the words her grandmother used to say at the bakery on Christian Street whenever someone walked in and looked at the 2 of them that way. Che Gardino pure. Let them look. Helena had said those words throughout her life, speaking in the Italian she had picked up from her husband's family, blending her Polish accent into every syllable, and Rosie hadn't spoken them aloud once in the 6 years since her grandmother's funeral. At the far end of the table, the man who had taken Gerald Fontaine's chair stood up. He rose before he had consciously decided to rise, something Rosie would understand later. But in that moment, she saw only his chair sliding backward, and every face at the table turning toward him. He spoke to her in that same language, slowly and clearly, his voice low. Che Gardino pure. My grandmother used to say that too. She added another sentence afterward, but I won't translate it at the dinner table. Clayton's spoon struck the rim of his china plate with a small, sharp click, and in the room that had fallen silent again, the sound seemed absurdly loud. Rosie looked at her former husband and saw something she had never seen on his face during their 4 years together. Genuine bewilderment. Clayton Whitfield Brenner hadn't known that his wife spoke Italian. He had slept beside her for 1,400 nights, and he hadn't known. He had never asked where she had grown up, never asked what her grandmother's name was, never asked why every August she drove down to Christian Street and sat in her car outside a bakery that had long since closed. He knew that she was the nurse from Fishtown. That was the entire file. The other man didn't sit down. Still speaking in that same ordinary voice, this time in English, he said, "This table is too crowded. There's a small table beside the window. Mrs. Ashworth, would you sit with me?" Clayton spoke, and his voice came out weaker than he intended. "We reserved 1 table for the whole group." The man turned and looked at him. He said nothing. He didn't frown, tilt his head, or do anything that anyone might later be able to describe. He simply looked at Clayton, and the look lasted for about 3 seconds, and Clayton Brenner sat down. Rosie watched it happen, unable to understand what she had just witnessed. She had seen her former husband argue face-to-face with the head of anesthesiology in the 6th floor hallway. She had watched him refuse to yield a single inch in 4 years, even when he was wrong. Yet he had just sat down because one man had looked at him for 3 seconds. They moved to the small table beside the window, overlooking Rittenhouse Square below with its lights and bare trees. Rosie sat down and realized that her hands were trembling, not from fear, but because she had held everything too tightly for too long during the past 30 minutes. The server approached, arranged the napkins, poured poured water into 2 glasses, then bent slightly toward the man and asked, "What may I bring you, Mr. Carraway?" Rosie didn't notice the name. She was looking out the window, thinking about her grandmother, trying to remember the second sentence Helena always used to say after the first. But at the other end of the larger table, 4 yards away, Preston Mahoney lowered his wineglass onto the table very slowly, using both hands. And for the rest of that evening, he didn't take another sip. She ordered chamomile tea. He ordered black coffee, without sugar or milk, and when the server walked away, he turned the empty cup in front of him a quarter turn and left it there, a small movement belonging to someone accustomed to sitting for long stretches at tables that weren't his own. Beyond the window, Rittenhouse Square gleamed beneath the rain and the lights, and Rosie realized that from where she sat, she could no longer see Clayton. She could only hear his voice carrying from the larger table, its usual fullness restored. They made light conversation for about 10 minutes. He asked which way she'd taken to get there, and she said 22nd Street. He said traffic always backed up around Market at that hour. She asked what he did, and he said transportation, and she left it there because she was perceptive enough to recognize when an answer had been deliberately shortened. He didn't ask about her divorce. He didn't ask why she was attending a dinner like this. After 4 straight weeks of being asked those questions by people who didn't truly want to hear the answers, not being asked made her feel so comfortable that it was almost uncomfortable. Then he set down his coffee cup and asked, without introduction or any change in his voice, as though it were simply the next question in a conversation that had been going on for a very long time, "You worked the night shift on April 27th of last year, didn't you?" Rosie had been lifting her teacup. She lowered it again. Outside the window, a taxi sounded its horn at the corner, and the noise seemed very far away. She hadn't told him where she worked. She hadn't told him which shift she worked. She hadn't mentioned a single date during the past 40 minutes. "How do you know the date?" He didn't evade the question, and later, whenever she thought back on that evening, that was the detail Rosie remembered most clearly, even more clearly than what he said. He didn't spend a single second considering whether he should lie. "For the past 18 months, once every month, I've read the intensive care unit schedule at St. Augustine Hospital. Every shift, not only yours. I know you work 3 nights a week, usually Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, except during the weeks when you exchange shifts with someone named Marchetti. I know you take additional weekend shifts at a clinic on Passyunk Avenue, the one with the neon sign where the letter E doesn't work. I know that during the past 18 months, you've requested exactly 2 days off, and you spent both of them in Balasinwid." Rosie stood up. She didn't remember deciding to rise. She only realized that she was already on her feet, one hand searching for the strap of her purse against the back of the chair, her heart pounding in her throat with the rhythm she'd come to know during nights when a patient suddenly crashed. The rhythm that told the body to run before the mind could understand. 7 years of working night shifts in South Philadelphia had taught a woman many things, and the first was that when a stranger knew your schedule better than you did, you didn't remain there to demand an explanation. The man didn't stand with her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't raise his voice. He only spoke, still seated, both hands resting on the tabletop where she could clearly see them. "I've known about you for 18 months. You've known me for 40 minutes. That isn't fair, and I don't intend to take advantage of it." She remained standing, her hand gripping the purse strap. "If you leave now, I won't look for you again. No messages, no calls, and no one appearing in the hospital parking lot. You'll never hear my name again, and I'll consider tonight as though it never happened. I promise you that, and I won't ask you to trust the promise of a man you've only just met." He paused. "But I need you to understand what's happening in this room before any more of it happens. This isn't about me. It's about you. You think tonight is a tasteless joke. It isn't." Rosie sat down. Later, many months later, she would lie awake trying to understand why she had sat down, and she would find several answers, but none of them would be enough. Perhaps it was because he'd told her everything before she had the chance to catch him hiding it. Perhaps it was because, in 4 years, no man had ever told her that something was unfair to her without attaching a price to the words. Or perhaps she was simply exhausted, and exhausted people often sit down, even in places they should be running from. She drew the teacup closer. Her hand was still trembling, and she allowed it to tremble. "Then who are you?" He looked at her for a moment before answering, and when he did, his voice was much lower, so low that she had to lean forward to hear him. I'm the older brother of a man you sat beside for 6 hours, and you don't even remember his face. His name was Peter, he said. He was 26 then. On the night of April 27th last year, they brought him into your unit at 3 o'clock in the morning. He was already in very bad condition, and I won't tell you why, because you already know. You saw it yourself. Rosie held the teacup between both hands. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't because of his lungs. By then, they had already taken care of his lungs. It was panic. He was so terrified that he couldn't hear anyone anymore. He turned the cup a quarter turn. Our birth mother died when he was 7. There was a woman who lived downstairs from us, Mrs. Sartori, and she looked after him for several years afterward. She taught him Italian, sang to him in Italian, scolded him in Italian, so even now, when he is truly afraid, English drains out of his mind like water. Nothing the doctors said to him meant anything. Nothing the nurses said meant anything. He lay there listening to a language he could no longer understand, and it only frightened him more. He raised his eyes to hers. Then one nurse stayed 6 hours past the end of her shift. She pulled a chair beside his bed, held his hand, and sang him a lullaby in that same language. He said she got some of the words wrong. He said her accent was strange, that there was something in it that wasn't Italian. But he slept. For the first time in 2 days, Rosie sat motionless. She tried. She truly tried. She searched her mind for the night of April 27th, and she found its shape, the familiar shape shared by every night like that. The machines, the hallway lights, the smell of alcohol, the dampness of sweat beneath her scrubs. But there was no face, not a single face. I don't remember him, she said, and she heard her own voice grow thin. I'm sorry, I don't remember. I know. You don't understand. It isn't that I forgot. I'm not allowed to remember. She set down the teacup. The first year, I remembered everything. I remembered names, faces, who came in and who left, and on which day. By the second year, I started dreaming about them. By the third year, I couldn't live anymore. I would stand inside the elevator and couldn't lift my hand to press the button. Then an older nurse told me, you have to learn to leave them at the door, or you'll last only 3.5 years. So I learned. I leave them at the door. I've been doing it for 7 years. She looked through the window. People call that coldness. My former husband called it coldness. Someone remembers you, he said. That is what I wanted you to know. You don't remember him. He has remembered you all these months. Rosie turned back to him. What do you do? He didn't evade the question this time, just as he hadn't before. There are 3 answers. The first is what I tell the tax authorities. I own a transportation company, 3 restaurants, and part of a dock in Delaware. The second is what people say behind my back in Kensington, and I won't repeat it here because you don't need to hear it from me. The third is the answer I give you, because you sat beside my brother for 6 hours without knowing who he was, and you never asked. He placed both hands on the table. I inherited something I didn't choose when I was 27, after my father was shot inside a laundromat on Torresdale Street. For 7 years, the only thing I have done is try to turn it into something that spills less blood. I'm not telling you that I'm a good man. I'm telling you that I have 3 rules, and I keep those 3 rules cleaner than I keep anything else. No women, no children, no hospitals. Rosie asked why there was a 3rd rule. He remained silent longer than she expected. When I was 19, my mother was receiving treatment. She was at home, and a nurse came 4 days a week. A car parked across the street from my house for 4 nights in a row. No one got out. No one did anything. No one knocked on the door or said a word to us. It simply remained there, then left in the morning. He looked down at his coffee cup. She stopped sleeping. She died 4 months later. Even now, I still don't know whether it was the illness, or whether it was because she had stopped sleeping. From the larger table came laughter, glasses touching, someone ordering more wine. Rosie heard those sounds from very far away. She looked at the man seated across from her, at the old watch around his wrist, and the large hands resting flat on the tablecloth, and waited to see whether her body was afraid. It wasn't. I've worked in intensive care for 7 years, she said. I've cared for men like you. I've washed their faces. I've called their wives at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm not afraid of you. I'm only tired. And for the first time that entire evening, August Volkov Caraway smiled. The smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. but something remained in the room after it was gone, and Rosie felt her shoulders lower slightly without her permission. She raised her teacup and took a sip, and he looked at her hand, looking longer than politeness allowed, long enough that she was about to pull it back. "You stopped," he said. "Stopped what?" "A string instrument. Not the piano. The piano leaves nothing behind." Rosie set down the cup, then, without understanding why, turned her left palm upward and looked at it as though she were truly seeing her own hand for the first time in many years. On the 3 fingertips, just below the uppermost joints, were 3 patches of skin, paler than the rest, smooth and faded, almost invisible, unless someone knew to look for them. "How did you know?" "Because when someone stops playing, the calluses gradually soften. They don't disappear completely. They only fade and remain there. Someone who never began has nothing to fade, and the hands of someone who still plays are entirely different. I can tell the moment I look." He spoke calmly, without any trace of trying to impress her. "You stopped. And you stopped when you were playing a great deal, not gradually over time. Those marks only form when someone practices 4 or 5 hours a day for many years." Rosie remained silent so long that the server passed their table and came around again. "I was 19, she said, 3 weeks after the acceptance letter arrived." He didn't ask why. He didn't say what a shame. He didn't say she must have been very talented. He only gave a small nod, then looked out the window to give her somewhere to breathe. And that was the first thing all evening that made Rosie's throat tighten, not because he was kind, but because in 9 years, no one had ever left her alone at that exact place. People always asked why. They asked why, listened to the answer, then said, "Oh God, I'm so sorry." And that expression of sympathy forced her to comfort them in return. And by the time it was over, she was exhausted from tending to someone else's feelings about her own loss. He didn't ask. She took another sip of tea and listened as her heartbeat began to slow. "I studied at Settlement," she said, surprised to hear herself speaking. "The music school on Queen Street. 12 years. My grandmother took me every Saturday from the time I was 6. We rode the number 47 bus, and she sat in the hallway through every lesson because she didn't trust the chairs in the waiting room." Then she continued, never intending to tell him, and yet telling him anyway, about those 4 years. About the $68,000 remaining on Clayton's medical school loans, paid in a single payment and cleared completely with the money from her mother's life insurance, the only thing that woman had left behind when she died. About the 2 years he spent in an unpaid cardiology fellowship, while Rosie worked 3 night shifts a week and weekends at the clinic on Passyunk Avenue, and the months when she came home at 7 o'clock in the morning, then woke again at 11 to cook him lunch to take with him. About the way he called the violin her sweet little girlhood hobby, and told her not to mention it at hospital parties because it made her sound as though she were trying to seem interesting, and she didn't need to try. "Where did he say that?" August asked. "In the car, on the way home from the Christmas party during our 2nd year." "Did you mention it at the party the following year?" "No." He made no comment. He only nodded again, and Rosie realized that he was doing exactly what a skilled nurse did while taking a medical history, asking very little, allowing the silences to last, and never reacting too strongly to an answer, because strong reactions taught people where they should stop speaking. She was about to continue when he asked, "And your brother? Who pays for Northfield?" "I do." She spoke the 2 words too quickly, her eyes never leaving the rim of her teacup. Then she immediately said, her voice entirely different and half a note higher, "You still haven't told me how your brother is now. Did he recover completely?" And August Volkov Caraway allowed her to change the subject. He told her about the classic car workshop in Port Richmond, about how Peter had quit using drugs, and about the wedding planned for the coming spring. He told her kindly and fully, and he didn't return to the earlier question even once for the rest of the evening. But he remembered it. 7 years of leading an organization where half the work consisted of sitting across from other people and listening to them speak had taught him one very simple thing. So simple it was almost crude. People lie at length, they explain. They add details to fill the empty spaces. The truth, however, is usually only a few words, spoken too quickly, accompanied by a place they cannot bring themselves to look. He finished telling her about the spring wedding and then stopped, making no effort to find another sentence to fill the space. The server passed their table twice. At the larger table, someone told a long story, and everyone laughed together. Rosie sat looking through the window, watching a man lead his dog across the square in the wind, and she waited for August to say something, anything, so she would have a reason to answer. He said nothing. He allowed the silence to remain where it was, and he didn't seem uncomfortable with it. And that was the very thing that opened her, because for 2 years, everyone around her had filled every quiet moment with prepared words of comfort, and no one had ever allowed her to sit in silence long enough to want to speak on her own. November 2nd, she said. 2 years ago. He didn't turn his head too quickly. He simply remained still. 22 weeks. I was home alone. It was evening. She lifted the teacup, then set it down again without drinking. Do you know the cruelest thing about being a nurse? It isn't that you know more than other people. It's that you aren't given even 1 second to hope incorrectly. Ordinary people get a few minutes, sometimes a few hours, when they can still think, maybe it isn't serious, maybe I'm only worrying too much. I didn't get a single minute like that. I understood exactly what was happening, and I knew exactly what it meant, and I knew it from the very first second. 7 years of studying and working in this profession, and my reward was that I wasn't allowed to deceive myself even once. She continued in an even voice, the same voice she used when giving a shift report. She called Clayton. He was in Boston for the annual cardiology conference, and that evening he was receiving the Promising Young Physician of the Year award, the award he had mentioned at dinner every night for the previous 3 weeks. She could hear glasses and voices on the other end of the line. He listened until she had finished speaking. Then he said, "Go to the emergency room. I'll take the morning flight home. You know that place better than I do anyway." He was right, Rosie said. That was the worst part. He was right. I really did know that place better than he did. She drove herself, from Fishtown to South Philadelphia, nearly 40 minutes, alone, both hands on the steering wheel, passing through the same streets she traveled every evening on her way to work. She parked in the employee lot. She entered through the same door she used every night at 7 o'clock. The 2 people who admitted her downstairs were co-workers whose names she knew, whose children's ages she knew, whose coffee preferences she knew, and she would continue working beside those 2 people every night for the next 3 years. And not once during those 3 years did anyone mention it again. 4:12 in the morning, she said. She fell silent for a while. I named her June. She reached into the pocket of the coat hanging over the back of her chair, took something out, and placed it on the tablecloth between them. It was a small white plastic hospital wristband, yellowed around the edges. The printed letters faded from being touched for 2 years. She said nothing more about it. I carry it with me, she said, all the time. I've never told anyone this story. Sister Maureen doesn't know. She knows I lost the baby, but she doesn't know about that night. Wesley doesn't know. My brother thinks Clayton took the evening flight home immediately. She pushed the wristband a little closer to herself, then left it there. I'm not angry that he was in Boston. People have responsibilities, and conferences are scheduled a year in advance. I'm angry because the next day, when he came home, he asked me exactly one question. He asked whether I'd told anyone. Not how I was, not what had happened. He asked whether I'd told anyone. August said nothing. He reached out and placed his palm face down on the tablecloth, about the width of one finger joint from her hand. He didn't touch her. He simply left his hand there. Beyond the window, the wind swept through the square, making the bare trees sway beneath the lights, while behind them at the larger table came the sounds of silverware and someone ordering more wine. Rosie looked down at the 2 hands resting close together on the white tablecloth. You aren't saying anything, she said. Because you haven't finished, he replied. People always think they've finished speaking. I'll wait. At 9:14 that evening, Rosie's phone began vibrating against the tablecloth, turning half a circle, and she saw the word Northfield glowing in the darkness beside the small white plastic wristband. She stood too quickly, the chair scraping backward across the wooden floor, and when she answered, she heard her own voice, the voice she hated most, the voice of someone who had spent years rehearsing how to respond to bad news. This is Rosalind Ashworth. The voice on the other end belonged to a young woman working the night shift, slightly hesitant and entirely calm. Wesley was fine. Wesley was watching television in the common room. They were calling about something else. Only a procedural matter. Nothing more. But policy required them to confirm it. At 6 o'clock that evening, a man had come to visit room 214. He had signed the visitor log properly, presented valid identification, stayed for 40 minutes, played a game of chess with Mr. Ashworth, then left before visiting hours ended. There had been no problem at all. It was only that Mr. Ashworth's records showed exactly one visitor during the past 4 years, his sister. So the night staff was required to call and confirm whether this man had been an authorized guest. Rosie stood in the middle of the dining room, with the phone pressed to her ear. What name did he write in the book? She heard pages turning. The first initial is P. The last name is Volkov. V-O-L-K-O-V. Rosie lowered the phone very slowly. She turned toward the man seated at the table beside the window, and for the first time in the 2 hours they had spent together, August Volkov Caraway's expression changed. Not by much. His jaw tightened slightly and his shoulders leaned forward. But Rosie had spent 7 years standing beside hospital beds, reading people's faces in the seconds before they received terrible news, and she read this as clearly as printed words. "I didn't know about that," he said. "I swear to you, I didn't know." "You can swear anything you like," Rosie said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "My brother is 24 years old, and he can't go anywhere. He lives in a room in Bala Sinwid, and he can't close the door himself when someone is standing in the doorway." "I know." "You don't know. You're right, I don't." He had already taken out his phone. He pressed a number and raised it to his ear, and he didn't stand, step into the hallway, or turn his back. He made the call right there in the restaurant, in front of her, and Rosie understood that he was doing it deliberately so she could see everything. The person on the other end answered after 2 rings. August spoke in Russian, very quickly and very softly, his voice falling until it was almost breath. Rosie didn't understand a single word. But she didn't need to. She had stood in hospital hallways and overheard hundreds of calls made at 4 o'clock in the morning, in every language imaginable, and she recognized this voice immediately. It was the voice of an older brother, afraid that his younger brother had just damaged something that could never be repaired. The call lasted less than a minute. He ended it, placed the phone face down on the table, and sat silently for 3 seconds, staring into the cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "He didn't bring anyone with him," he said. "He went alone, in his own car. He brought a chessboard." Rosie sat down because her legs no longer wanted to hold her. "My brother has been playing chess online with someone for the past 18 months, he said, at 3 o'clock in the morning. "He hasn't been able to sleep since that night in your unit. The doctor prescribed medication, but he won't take it. He says that if he does, he won't wake up if something happens. So he stays awake, and he plays chess with some stranger somewhere, and the two of them talk nonsense to each other at 3 o'clock in the morning, night after night, for 18 months. He raised his eyes to hers. "He didn't know the other man was your brother." Rosie opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Do you know when he found out?" He spoke those words more slowly than anything else he had said that evening. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Rosie sat with the number inside her head, trying to place it somewhere, trying to understand why it sent cold spreading across the back of her neck, trying to remember what else had happened 3 weeks earlier, something she had heard someone mention. She hadn't yet put it together, because at that exact moment, at the larger table behind her, a chair was shoved sharply backward, and Clayton Whitfield Brenner rose to his feet, and the entire dining room turned to look. Clayton crossed the room with his wineglass still in his hand, smiling as he spoke in a voice loud enough for all 3 of the other tables to hear. "Rosie, I hope you told him this was only a harmless little joke. Nothing serious." He stopped beside the table and rested one hand on the back of the empty chair, taking the posture of a host. Rosie remained seated. She had learned long ago that refusing to answer was the only weapon she possessed in rooms like this, but Clayton was no longer speaking to her. He turned toward the man sitting across from her and lowered his voice to precisely the level people used when they wanted to sound as though they were speaking privately, while actually making sure the entire room could hear. "You'll have to forgive her. She's been through a great deal. Night shifts, pressure, you understand. There are times when she isn't entirely stable." Rosie stood up. She didn't decide to rise. Her knee struck the edge of the table, knocking over the water glass, and the water spread across the white tablecloth in a dark stain, before spilling over the edge and down the front of her dark blue wool dress, freezing cold through the fabric. "Don't ever say that again." Her voice came out louder than she intended, louder than she had allowed herself to be in 4 years, so loud that even she startled at the sound of it. "You don't get to say that about me. Not here, not in the doctor's lounge, not anywhere. The entire dining room turned to look. The server froze halfway down the aisle, with a water pitcher in his hand. The two residents sat straighter. Cordelia Brenner lowered her fork very gently. And Clayton didn't step back. He didn't look surprised at all. That was the first thing that pierced Rosie through the heat burning across her face. He wasn't surprised. He only tilted his head slightly, and in that moment, he looked exactly as he did in the operating room when everything was unfolding according to plan. And it was then, standing upright in the middle of the dining room with cold water running down her dress, that Rosie's eyes caught it. On the larger table, about a hand's width from where Clayton had been sitting, a phone lay face down on the tablecloth. Its screen was turned downward and dark, but near the upper corner of the device, beside the edge, a tiny red light glowed steadily without blinking. 7 years in intensive care had taught a woman many things, and one of them was that her eyes would automatically scan every indicator light within sight, without waiting for her mind to give the command. She had spent thousands of hours in dark rooms, filled only with the sounds of machines and tiny points of light, and her body had learned to distinguish which lights were normal, which meant danger, and which meant something was running. Clayton used to laugh at her for it. He once told her that even at home, she stared at the microwave as though it were a ventilator. He called it her funny little professional habit. A red light, steady, not blinking. It meant the device was recording. And the entire evening rearranged itself inside Rosie's mind within the span of a single heartbeat, arranging itself with the exact and merciless clarity of a laboratory result placed before her. The name, card, the joke told in advance, loudly and generously, with 6 people laughing along, the way Clayton had presented her before a stranger and then called her unstable, the way he hadn't been surprised when she raised her voice. This wasn't a dinner arranged to humiliate her for amusement. No one reserved a private room at the Rittenhouse merely to collect a story for the doctor's lounge. This was about gathering evidence. He needed a recording with a date, a time, a location, and 6 respectable witnesses, including 2 residents and his mother, capturing the voice of a woman raising her voice in a public dining room and losing control in front of strangers. He needed it because an accusation was already sitting before the ethics committee at St. Augustine Hospital, alleging that nurse Rosalind Ashworth had made a medication dosage error during the night shift on the 7th, and an accusation like that required a story to accompany it. It needed a woman with an unpredictable temper. It needed someone people could hear about once, and nod as though everything suddenly made sense. Water was still dripping from the edge of the tablecloth onto the floor, 1 drop at a time, each one clearly audible in the silent room. Rosie stood there and understood the final thing, the coldest thing of all. They didn't need her to be wrong. They had never needed her to be wrong. They only needed her to sound as though she was, and she had just given them 30 perfect seconds. There is one thing 7 years in intensive care teaches a person, and it isn't written in any book. When someone begins to collapse, you have 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds aren't for doing anything. They are for stopping your reaction and beginning to think. Anyone who doesn't have those 4 seconds will run, shout, reach for the wrong thing, and the person lying in the bed will pay the price. Rosie had taught those 4 seconds to 3 generations of new nurses. She stood in the middle of the Rittenhouse Hotel dining room, her dress wet, her face burning, the entire room watching her, and she counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then she sat down. She pulled in her chair, picked up the napkin, and wiped the water from the tabletop with slow, even movements, wiping all of it away, including the water that had reached the edge. She folded the wet napkin in half, then into quarters, and placed it to the right of her plate. No one in the room said anything. The server was still standing in the same place, with the water pitcher in his hand. When Rosie raised her head, she didn't look at Clayton. She looked directly at the phone lying face down on the tablecloth at the larger table. Then, she spoke slowly, separating every word and pronouncing each one clearly, the way she read a medication order over the telephone at 3 o'clock in the morning to a pharmacist who was still half asleep. "You're right, Clayton. I'm unstable." The entire table fell silent. Someone at the table behind them set down a knife. "I've been unstable since 4:12 in the morning on November 2nd, 2 years ago." She allowed the silence to remain for exactly 2 beats. "You know precisely why. Would you like me to tell the whole table? Or would you prefer to tell them yourself?" Clayton didn't answer. He was still standing there with one hand on the back of the chair, and Rosie saw what 7 years beside hospital beds had taught her to recognize: The moment when a person realized that the script inside his head had suddenly turned in another direction, and he didn't have the next page. "Go on," she said. "You're recording this. Make sure you say it clearly." At the larger table, Preston Mahoney reached out too quickly. He grabbed the phone and turned it face down once again, an entirely meaningless movement because it was already face down, the movement of someone who had just been caught and whose body reacted before his mind could think. It was the only small sound that everyone heard throughout the entire evening. Both residents turned to look at him. Rosie saw the younger man's ears slowly turning red, and in that silence, Cordelia Brenner set down her glass of water, turned in her chair, and asked her son, in a very quiet voice, the voice she used in church when she didn't want the pew behind her to hear, "What are you recording?" Rosie remained perfectly still. During 4 years as Cordelia Brenner's daughter-in-law, she had heard Cordelia ask many questions. She asked Rosie why she wasn't going with Clayton to the fundraiser that week. She asked whether Rosie intended to work night shifts forever. She asked why Clayton had been losing weight lately, and whether Rosie cooked anything at home. 6 months before the divorce, she asked whether Rosie had ever considered that perhaps the problem was Rosie herself. 4 years, hundreds of questions, and every one of them had been about Clayton but directed at Rosie, as though her son were a weather system that only his wife was responsible for explaining. Not once had Cordelia turned toward him. Now she did. Clayton said, "Mother, this isn't what you think." "I haven't thought anything yet," Cordelia said. "I asked what you're recording. This is a professional matter. At a private family dinner." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't raise it even slightly. But Rosie saw Cordelia's ringed hand resting on the edge of the table and watched her thumb rub a small circle into the tablecloth, and she realized that the woman was keeping herself calm in exactly the same way Rosie did, and Rosie had never imagined that the two of them shared anything at all. At the table beside the window, August Volkov Caraway didn't say a word. He sat motionless with both hands resting on the table, watching Rosie and no one else. It was the first question in 4 years that Cordelia Brenner had asked her son instead of asking her daughter-in-law, and Rosie understood that everything that followed would no longer resemble anything Clayton had prepared. Rosie reached down for the purse hanging from the back of her chair. She placed it on her lap, opened the clasp, and the entire room followed the movement of her hands, and she knew they were waiting for an envelope, because in the stories people told one another, there was always an envelope. She took out 3 notebooks, 3 imitation leather notebooks, bought at the CVS pharmacy on Girard Avenue, the kind that cost $4 apiece, and were displayed beside the batteries and chewing gum. All 4 corners had been worn smooth and rounded. The spine of the bottom notebook had split and been repaired with clear tape, and a dark crescent-shaped stain marked the right corner of its cover, left by a coffee cup set down there too many times. She placed them on the tablecloth before her and didn't open them immediately. "After I lost June," she said, "I started forgetting things." Her voice had returned to normal. Not calm, but normal. The steady voice she used at 7 o'clock in the morning while standing at the foot of a bed and giving report to the next shift. "I forgot whether I'd taken my medication. I forgot whether I'd locked the door. Some days I turned the car around halfway down the street to go home and check, then forgot again. I forgot what my husband had said to me the day before. I'm a nurse. I knew what it was called. I knew it happened after things like that, and I knew it usually went away on its own. But at the time, I didn't dare wait for it to go away." She placed one hand on the top notebook. "So I did the only thing a nurse knows how to do when her memory begins to fail. I gave myself a shift report. Every night before bed, 3 lines, the date, what happened, and the amount of money, whenever money was involved." She looked up. "I didn't write any of it as evidence against anyone. During those 2 years, the thought never crossed my mind even once. I wrote it so I wouldn't lose whatever remained of me." No one spoke. Cordelia Brenner was staring at the 3 notebooks with the expression of someone who had just realized what she was looking at. "He watched me write every night for 2 years, Rosie said. "I sat on the edge of the bed, with the bedside lamp on, wrote 3 lines, then turned off the light. 700 nights. He called it my sweet little anxiety habit." She opened the second notebook with her thumb. "He never opened it once. It wasn't my carefulness that saved me. It was his contempt." Then she began to read. She didn't dramatize anything. She didn't emphasize certain words, pause for breath, or look up to see how anyone was reacting. She read exactly as she would give a shift report, and that was what made it frightening. March 14th. Transferred $68,000. Paid off CB's medical school loan. Source: Mother's life insurance. She turned a page. June 21st. CB told people at the department party that I don't enjoy going out. I worked 3 night shifts that week. Another page. November 2nd. 4:12 in the morning. Lost June. CB in Boston. Received award at 8 o'clock that evening. Someone at the larger table drew in a breath. Rosie didn't look up. She turned several more pages, searched, then stopped. August 9th. CB told his mother that the Brenner family was paying for Wesley's care at Northfield. She continued reading in the same, even voice. I called Northfield 3 times. The first call was to the accounting department. The second was to the chief financial officer. The third was to request a copy of the complete 4-year payment history. There has never been a transfer from anyone named Brenner. Not once. She closed the notebook. In the second-floor dining room of the Rittenhouse Hotel, no one moved. The server had retreated until his back was near the wall and stood there with both hands folded before his stomach. The posture good servers adopted when they understood that what was happening didn't belong to them. One of the 2 residents was staring down at his plate and didn't dare look up. Preston Mahoney stared at the phone lying face down on the table before him as though it had suddenly become a living creature. And Clayton remained exactly where he had been, one hand resting on the back of the empty chair, though that hand was now clenched so tightly that Rosie could see the pale tendons rising over his knuckles. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his mother. Rosie said nothing more. She had intended to. She already had a sentence prepared inside her mind. A sentence she had written and rewritten during the 40-minute drive there that evening. A sentence about how he had taken 4 years from her, and she wouldn't give him 1 more minute. But when she opened her mouth, she realized that sentence belonged only to her, not to this room, and she would keep what belonged to her. So she remained silent. She stacked the 3 notebooks neatly, the thickest one on the bottom, placed them in the center of the white tablecloth, and sat still. For 8 seconds, no one in that room moved. Rosie counted them, not intentionally, but simply because her body had grown accustomed to counting everything. Then Cordelia Brenner placed both hands on the edge of the table and stood. She didn't look at Rosie. She stood upright in her cream cashmere sweater, 66 years old, a daughter-in-law and a mother within 3 generations of a medical family in Bryn Mawr, and she looked at her son. I signed those checks. The entire room turned toward her. Clayton said, "Mother." I signed them, she continued, speaking neither faster nor louder. For the first 6 months after her brother's accident, I signed them on the 5th of every month. I remember because that was also the day I paid the gardener. I sent the first 4 directly to Northfield. I gave the next 2 to you because you said you would transfer them for me. She turned her gaze toward the empty space above Rosie's head, the way people looked when searching for something they had put away too long ago. Then, in the 7th month, you told me to stop. Rosie sat perfectly still. The 3 notebooks remained stacked on the tablecloth before her. This is what you said to me, Cordelia continued. You said, Mother, Rosie feels terribly uncomfortable about it. She wants to provide for her brother herself. If you keep doing this, she'll feel as though she owes our family something. She has her pride. Don't hurt her. She paused for 1 beat. And I stopped. I thought I was being considerate. I thought I was a sensible mother-in-law who knew when to step back and how to respect her daughter-in-law's dignity. I told that story at the club 3 times, perhaps 4. I told it as though it were a good story. My friends told me that people who knew how to behave that way were rare these days. Rosie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had never said those words. She had never heard anyone mention a single check during those 4 years. Throughout those 4 years, she had stood at the cashier's desk at Northfield on the 5th of every month, signed the payment authorization, and many of those times she had only just finished a night shift, with the smell of the hospital still clinging to her hair. Cordelia looked at her again, and this time she looked directly into her eyes. Clayton told me you wanted to see me tonight. She spoke much more slowly now, as though she herself were hearing the words for the first time. He called me on Sunday. He said, Rosie wants to see you, Mother. She wants to discuss the money for her brother. Please come. I think it's time. Rosie raised her head. He told me that you wanted to see me. The 2 women looked at each other across the table covered in white linen. Neither spoke for several seconds, and during those seconds, They both understood something no one else in the room could understand, not because the others lacked intelligence, but because they hadn't spent 4 years sitting at opposite ends of the same thread. For 4 years, these two women had never truly spoken to each other. They believed they had. They had sat beside one another at dozens of dinners, exchanged thousands of sentences, and stood together in the kitchen washing dishes on Thanksgiving. But every matter that truly mattered had reached them through the same man, and that man had translated every sentence in precisely the way he needed. Rosie believed her mother-in-law despised her. Cordelia believed her daughter-in-law was proud and distant. They had both believed it for 4 years, and they had both believed it because the information came from the same source. Cordelia wasn't angry. That was what Rosie would remember for years afterward. There was no anger on the woman's face, only a weariness so profound that it seemed to hollow out every feature, the weariness of someone who had just realized she had wandered very far from the path and was only now looking back at the road behind her. "You used me," she said to Clayton. Her voice remained quiet. "For 4 years. You used me to say the things you didn't want to say yourself. You allowed me to believe I was being kind while I was doing the things you considered too dirty to touch with your own hands." Clayton said, "Mother, you're far too emotional right now." "There," she said. "There, you've done it again. You just did to me exactly what you did to your wife in front of this entire room. Am I emotional? Yes. But that isn't what you just said, is it?" She remained standing for 1 more second, then sat down. She didn't sit because she had finished speaking, nor because she had regained her composure. Rosie saw it clearly. Cordelia sat because her legs could no longer support her, and she knew it, and she had timed the movement precisely so she could lower herself before anyone noticed. 7 years of watching people clutch the rails of hospital beds to keep themselves from falling had taught Rosie how to recognize that movement in any room, and at the exact moment Cordelia Brenner touched the seat of her chair, the private dining room door opened for the 2nd time that evening. The person who entered was an elderly woman wearing a gray sweater and a wooden cross, polished smooth at both ends from being held too often, carrying a canvas bag that anyone who had ever worked at St. Augustine Hospital would recognize. Sister Maureen Doyle, 71 years old, had overseen the palliative care unit since 1979. She hadn't been invited. She stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds to orient herself, then walked straight toward the larger table. And Rosalind Ashworth, contrary to everything the 10 people in that room expected, panicked. She sprang to her feet for the 2nd time that evening. "Sister, don't." Sister Maureen didn't stop. "Sister Maureen, please." Rosie heard her own voice break on the final word, and she couldn't control it, because she knew exactly what was inside that canvas bag. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon, Sister Maureen had called her into the small room at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, closed the door, and placed a stack of printed papers in front of her. Rosie had read them in 4 minutes. Then she pushed them back and said, "Don't submit them, sister." And when Maureen didn't answer, Rosie said it again, and the 3rd time she took the older woman's hand as she spoke. The reason was simple, and Rosie had explained it 3 times during those 4 minutes. If those papers reached the committee without carrying enough weight, the first person suspended wouldn't be anyone else. The report accusing her of making a medication dosage error had already been sitting before the committee for 11 days. In the committee's eyes, there was only one possible interpretation when a nurse under disciplinary investigation turned around and accused a surgeon from the Brenner family, and that interpretation would be written into her record in ink that couldn't be erased. She would lose her license. And that license wasn't a piece of paper. That license was $4,200 a month. It was room 214. It was a 24-year-old man with no one else in the world to pay for his care. For 7 years, Rosie had lived with that fear the way a person lives with a ringing in the ears that eventually becomes familiar. Sister Maureen placed the canvas bag on the table, took out the stack of papers, and laid them on the white tablecloth. "I knew you would say that," she said, "so I didn't ask you again." She turned the first page with one finger. "This is a printed copy of the hospital's electronic medical record access log concerning the patient named in the report, covering the period from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning on the 7th. I have the authority to request this record because I've served on the ethics committee since 1994. I requested it 3 weeks ago, and I signed for it properly, with the date and time recorded." She pushed the paper toward the center of the table. "It shows one very simple thing. During that entire night shift, Nurse Rosalind Ashworth's account never logged into the system. Not once. Because she wasn't in the hospital that night. She was at Northfield in Bala Sinwid. And they have a camera at the entrance and a visitor log. I called them, and they still have both records. No one in the room moved, but there was another account, Sister Maureen said, still speaking in the steady voice of someone reading a Sunday service announcement. At 2:41 in the morning, that account opened the patient's record, reviewed the medication orders, and remained there for 19 minutes. The account belonged to a resident physician who had left the hospital 3 weeks before that night. No one had deactivated it. That happens all the time. I've been complaining about it since computers still used floppy disks. She turned to the final page, and the system recorded the address of the computer used to access the file. That computer was located inside the cardiology department office on the 6th floor. No one said anything. Rosie could hear the heating system running somewhere inside the walls. Sister Maureen straightened and looked once around the table, looking past Clayton, past Cordelia, past the two residents, without lingering longer on anyone. "I'm not accusing anyone in this room," she said. "I'm 71 years old, and I don't have much time left for accusations. They take too much energy and heal nothing. I have only brought a paper I printed 3 weeks ago. On Monday morning, it will be placed before the committee together with my request to reopen the case. Anyone who has something to say before Monday morning should say it now. After Monday, you can say it to someone else, not to me." Then she turned toward Rosie, and her voice changed completely, softening into the voice of an elderly woman speaking to a girl she had known since the girl was 19 years old and sleeping in a plastic chair beside her mother's hospital bed. "You told me not to come. I'm sorry." She placed her hand over the back of Rosie's hand. "I've listened to you for 6 years. Every time you said, 'Let it go, sister. I can bear it,' I listened. I kept thinking that was how I respected you. Lately, I've begun to think that was my mistake." She placed the stack of papers in the center of the table and stepped back. No one reached for them, but at the far end of the table, Preston Mahoney was staring at those pages, and he had stopped breathing. Preston Mahoney stared at the paper for exactly 3 seconds, and during those 3 seconds, he understood everything. The account that had never been deactivated belonged to Danny Vashti, the man who had shared an apartment with him for 2 years during residency, the man who had moved to Cleveland 3 weeks before the night of the 7th, the man who had left behind a coat, an air fryer, and a password he had never changed because he never changed anything. Preston was the only person in the world who still knew that password. And the computer on the 6th floor, inside the cardiology department office, was a computer in a room whose door code was shared by only 2 people. The name that would be placed before the committee on Monday morning wouldn't be Clayton Whitfield Brenner's. He shot to his feet, sending the chair backwards so violently that it nearly overturned, and the entire room turned for the 3rd time that evening. "You told me all I had to do was sit still and let her humiliate herself in front of the whole department, so people would finally stop asking why you got divorced. Preston, not now. You didn't tell me you signed that report." His voice had risen, and he could no longer control it. "You didn't tell me you were planning to take away her nursing license. You aren't allowed to say that." "Enough." The voice came from the table beside the window, very low, no louder than the heating system inside the walls, and the entire room went silent. August Volkov Caraway remained seated, both hands resting on the tabletop. "She doesn't need to say anything else. You've already shown your hand." Preston wasn't listening anymore. He had crossed beyond the point where a person could still hear anyone. He confessed to everything, speaking quickly, spilling one sentence over another, speaking as though he were pouring water from a barrel that had been cracked for a very long time. That evening at Dirty Frank's, near the end of the month, the 2 of them had been sitting in the right corner where they always sat. Clayton had said, "Prez, I only need to look at one chart. My account is locked because of the password change, and it'll take 3 days to restore it. 5 minutes. That's all." Preston had given him Danny's password and hadn't asked a single question, because during the 8 years they had known each other, he had never asked a second question. Then he turned toward Sister Maureen, and his voice broke in the middle of the sentence. "The name on your paper is mine, isn't it?" She didn't answer. "It isn't his name. It was never his name. Danny's account, Danny's password, and I'm the only person who still knew it. All the committee has to do is ask one question." Sister Maureen Doyle looked at him. Then she nodded once, very slowly. Preston stood there with one hand gripping the back of the chair, and only then, after panic had shattered the door and flooded out into the open, did conscience quietly step across the threshold. "My mother worked as a nurse at Temple for 31 years, he said, his voice falling much lower. She retired in June. She still tells her neighbors that her son is a doctor. He looked at Rosie for the first time that entire evening. I've been sitting here for 2 hours, watching a 71-year-old woman bring out something she printed 3 weeks ago. I couldn't stop thinking about my mother. I kept wondering what she would say if she knew my name was in that file." Clayton sat down, very slowly, the way a person sits after standing too long in a place where he no longer has the right to stand. He didn't look at Preston, his mother, or the stack of papers in the center of the table. He looked at Rosie. "My grandfather was chief of surgery at Jefferson," he said. His voice was no longer the warm, rounded voice he used in hospital rooms. It was only the voice of a 37-year-old man sitting in a dining room with spilled water on the floor. "My father has an operating room named after him on the 4th floor. You walk past it every day. I'm the first Brenner in 3 generations to get divorced." He lowered his eyes to the tablecloth. "Do you know what my mother asks me every Sunday? For 13 months. She pours the coffee, sits down, and asks, 'What really happened, Clay?'" He fell silent for a very long time, and I didn't have a single answer that didn't make me look like a failure. Rosie remained still. She had imagined this moment more times than she cared to admit. In the car, inside hospital elevators, during empty night shifts at 4 o'clock in the morning. She had imagined it would feel sweet. It didn't. She sat there looking at the man who had taken 4 years of her life, and she realized she felt no satisfaction at all, and that exhausted her more than anything else that had happened that evening. For 4 years, she had believed her husband was cruel, because cruelty at least had a shape. It was something she could hate. It turned out that he was only afraid. He was so afraid that he had gone searching for an answer, and she was the cheapest answer he could find to a question his mother asked every Sunday morning. August Volkov Caraway stood. He fastened the button of his suit jacket with 2 fingers, unhurriedly, the movement of a man preparing to leave rather than preparing to speak. He didn't approach the larger table. He remained where he was beside the window, and addressed Clayton in the most ordinary voice he had used throughout the evening. So ordinary that the people at the tables behind them had to lean forward to hear. "I have 3 rules, Dr. Brenner. No women, no children, no hospitals." He allowed the silence to rest for 1 beat. "Those 3 rules have allowed me to sleep for the past 7 years. I haven't told you that I'm a good man, and I don't need you to believe I am. I'm only telling you that there are 3 things I don't touch, and tonight you violated all 3 in the same room, within 2 hours, in front of your mother." He looked down at the stack of papers, still lying in the middle of the white tablecloth. "And you did it through paperwork. That is the one thing I can't forgive, because paperwork requires no courage. A person types a few lines at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 6th floor, then goes home and sleeps, and 3 weeks later, a 30-year-old woman loses both her profession and her means of caring for her brother, without anyone having to look into her face while it happens." Clayton raised his head. Rosie saw it clearly, and years later she would still remember the expression on his face. He was waiting. The entire room was waiting. Everyone knew what the next sentence was supposed to be. Everyone had seen enough movies to know what a man like August was expected to say at precisely this moment, and perhaps some part of Rosie was waiting for it too, and she would have to live with the fact that she had waited. Then August said, "I won't touch that case. Not with 1 finger." Silence. Preston Mahoney turned his head. "You're waiting for me to threaten you," August continued, still calm. "You need me to do that. Tomorrow morning you'll have a brand new story to carry into the doctor's lounge. You'll tell your mother, your entire department, and everyone at the Marion Club on Saturday afternoon what kind of man your former wife has become involved with. You'll say you were threatened in the middle of the Rittenhouse Hotel and that now everyone finally understands why the marriage couldn't be saved." He pushed his chair neatly against the edge of the table. "That is the answer you've been searching for during the past 13 months, so I won't give it to you." He picked up the coat hanging over the back of the chair. "On Monday morning, the committee will rule according to what is written on those pages, and perhaps you'll escape. I believe you will, Dr. Brenner, because no one can prove whose fingers struck the keyboard on the 6th floor at 2:41 in the morning." He draped the coat over his arm. "Then you'll have to live with that, not with being innocent. You'll have to live with knowing you escaped because no one could prove that your hands did the typing, not because you didn't do it." Chairs scraped against the wooden floor. The two residents stood first. The younger one dropped his napkin and didn't pick it up, and both men walked toward the door without saying goodbye to anyone. Preston Mahoney followed, carrying his coat, and as he passed Clayton's chair, he didn't turn his head even once. Sister Maureen Doyle picked up her canvas bag, rested her hand on Rosie's shoulder for exactly 2 seconds, then left as well. Cordelia Brenner was the last to rise. She put on her coat slowly, adjusted the collar, and picked up her purse. Then she walked past the chair where her son sat, and she didn't stop. She didn't look down. She walked straight through the doorway, and the sound of her heels gradually faded along the carpeted hallway. August Volkov Caraway paused at the threshold, looked back at Rosie once without speaking, then stepped outside to wait. 2 people remained in the room, with a puddle of water partly dried on the floor and a stack of papers lying in the middle of the table that no one had taken away. Without raising his head, Clayton said, "You could have told me. About that night. You never told me." Rosie stood. She gathered the 3 notebooks, tapped their edges lightly against the tabletop to straighten them, then placed them inside her purse. She put on her coat. When she had almost reached the door, she stopped, turned back, and answered him in her ordinary voice, the voice she used when giving a shift report, without raising it even half a note. "I did tell you. At 4:13 in the morning. You didn't answer the second time." Outside, the wind blew up from the river. The kind of November wind in Philadelphia that didn't bite the skin but slipped through every layer of clothing and remained there. Rittenhouse Square glowed beneath the lights, the bare trees standing motionless within circles of yellow, while 3 taxis idled along the curb waiting for passengers, their exhaust curling beneath the street lamps like something breathing. Sister Maureen Doyle was waiting at the foot of the steps with the canvas bag over her shoulder. She didn't say anything. She only opened her arms, and Rosie stepped into them, allowing herself to remain there longer than she'd intended. The older woman's sweater smelled of hospital detergent, the scent Rosie had known since she was 19. 6 years ago, Sister Maureen said into her hair, "You sat in my office and asked whether God was punishing you because you had hoped." Rosie remembered that room. She remembered the plastic chair. She even remembered the crack in the ceiling. "I gave you the wrong answer. I told you to be patient." Maureen drew back, both hands still holding Rosie's shoulders. "I should have told you to run." The phone inside Rosie's coat pocket began to vibrate. She looked at the screen and answered, and Wesley's voice on the other end sounded fully awake. The voice of someone who was still awake close to 10 o'clock at night and would remain awake until morning. "Are you all right? Why did you call Sister Maureen?" There was silence for several seconds. "Because I've been lying here for 18 months, he said. "And I know you wouldn't call anyone. You've never called anyone. Not once. That's your problem, Rosie. Not that man, not that hospital, not your license." Rosie stood on the sidewalk with one hand holding her coat collar closed against the wind, and she couldn't say anything. "You still have the violin, don't you?" She looked across the street into the darkness beyond the trees, and this time she told the truth. "Yes, I still have it." He said nothing more. He only murmured yes, then ended the call, and Rosie stood there holding the phone after the screen had gone dark, realizing that her brother had been waiting 6 years for that answer. August Volkov Caraway stood several steps away. A black car was parked at the corner, and Rosie assumed it belonged to him, but he didn't walk toward it or invite her inside. He only asked whether she wanted to walk for a while. They walked 3 blocks down toward Walnut Street, slowly, neither speaking during the first block. Halfway through the second, he said, "There is something I didn't tell you inside. Go ahead. For the past 14 months, your brother's Northfield bill has been reduced by 40%. Rosie stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. A pedestrian had to walk around her. "You believe it is a state assistance program," he said. "They sent you a letter with an official seal, and you called twice to confirm it, and both times they told you it was legitimate because it is." Rosie couldn't speak. She remembered that letter. She remembered sitting in her car in the Northfield parking lot and reading it 3 times, then crying, the ashamed tears of a woman whose burden had suddenly been lightened without her understanding why. "Northfield has a fund," he said. "It was established in 1996 for spinal cord injury patients under 30. The fund stopped operating 5 years ago because it ran out of money. No one donated anymore, and no one bothered to mention it. I refinanced it through my transportation company as a corporate donation, with contracts, tax deductions, and audits. Everything is legal, and you can verify it." He looked directly at her. I don't choose who receives assistance. I'm not permitted to, and I don't want to. I included only one condition in the funding agreement. Priority should be given to patients under 30 whose immediate family caregiver works in healthcare. Rosie opened her mouth. Your brother is one of 4 people who qualified, he said. The other 3 received the same reduction. 1 is in Norristown, and 2 are in Chester. Those 3 families will never know my name, and I don't know theirs. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. I didn't buy your brother's safety. I reopened a door someone had closed because the money ran out. Then I stepped away from the hallway. That is the only way I know how to do something kind without turning it into a chain. Rosie stood in the wind for a long time. Then why are you telling me now? She asked. You kept it hidden for 14 months. You could have kept it hidden forever. Because tonight you read your notebooks aloud in front of 12 people, he said, and I won't become the second man in your life who keeps a book you aren't allowed to read. 3 weeks later, Rosie drove up to Port Richmond on a Saturday morning. Peter Volkov's workshop stood at the end of a row of red brick warehouses, its rolling door raised all the way, and inside, the smell of engine oil mingled with coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. Peter was 26, thin, with untidy hair, and he spoke 3 times faster than his older brother, and laughed even when there was nothing worth laughing about. He pulled down his collar to show Rosie the scar as though displaying a medal, and he told her the doctor had done an awful job stitching it, but it didn't matter because the important thing was that he was still there. Then he took out his wallet and removed a sheet of paper from the innermost compartment, folded into quarters, worn soft along the creases until it felt almost like cloth. A nurse's note, signed R. Ashworth, registered nurse. Rosie held it and didn't immediately recognize her own handwriting, because it was the handwriting of someone writing at 4 o'clock in the morning. He told her to turn it over. On the back, written in ballpoint ink, was a line in Italian that she had completely forgotten writing, the words her grandmother used to sing on the 2nd floor of the bakery on Christian Street. Every piece of music needs somewhere to breathe. Rosie sat down on a folding chair in the workshop and couldn't speak for a long while. Then Peter said there was another one. He handed her a second sheet, dated 3 weeks before the evening at the Rittenhouse. It was an ordinary shift handoff note for bed number 7, concerning a patient whose face Rosie couldn't remember at all. At the bottom of the page, she had written one line for the nurse taking over the next shift. Patient worried about the bill. Social services contacted. Please follow up during the next shift. No one should have to ask twice. Peter told her that the patient was his future mother-in-law. You didn't know her. She didn't know you. You wrote that line at 7 o'clock in the morning after a 12-hour shift for someone you would never see again. Then he sat across from her, rested both elbows on his knees, and said the sentence that turned everything over. My brother found you after 3 weeks, Rosie. Only 3 weeks. He had your name, where you worked, everything. Then he kept reading for another 17 months. Peter folded the paper and placed it in her hand. He stopped searching for you a long time ago. He only kept reading. That same day, Rosie drove down to Christian Street and went to Renzi's bakery, a place she hadn't entered in 6 years. Antonia Renzi, 68 years old, recognized her before she even came through the door, and she didn't say anything. She simply went into the back room and returned carrying a violin case. It wasn't the violin lying inside the closet in Fishtown. This one was older and finer. Antonia explained that after leaving the hospital, Peter had returned to the bakery and sung a song for her. He sang the melody incorrectly, got almost all the words wrong, and told her that a nurse had sung it to him at 3 o'clock in the morning. Antonia dropped heavily into a chair in the middle of the bakery because she had heard that song for 20 years, sung by a Polish woman on the 2nd floor to a brown-haired little girl sitting beside the window with a violin tucked beneath her chin. Inside the violin case was an envelope. It contained a letter written in Krakow in 1961. The ink faded to brown. Helena had written the letter to herself when she was 22, after refusing an opportunity to study music so she could marry and move to America, and she had never read it again. You will tell everyone that you chose this. You will repeat it until you believe it. But Helena, there is a note you haven't played, and it will remain there all your life, and it isn't angry with you. It is only waiting. Every piece of music needs somewhere to breathe. So do you. Breathe. Rosie stood in the middle of the bakery reading a letter written by a 22-year-old girl in Krakow, and she understood that her grandmother had lived this same life 60 years before her and had never told anyone. 6 weeks later, On a Saturday morning at Settlement Music School on Queen Street, Rosie stood before a small group and taught violin without charge. 8-year-old Nadia Okonkwo played the A note incorrectly for 4 straight weeks, and every week she burst into laughter whenever she missed it. During the 5th week, she played it correctly and spun around, her eyes shining. "Miss Rosie, did you hear that?" She had heard it. Rosie didn't leave nursing. She continued working in intensive care because it was part of who she was, not a trap that imprisoned her. But every Tuesday afternoon, she returned to Sister Maureen's palliative care unit and played violin there, exactly as she had when she was 19. The committee concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to assign individual responsibility. Clayton kept his career. Preston Mahoney accepted full responsibility, lost his medical license for 2 years, and didn't name anyone else. He said only one sentence: "My hands did the typing, and no one held them there." Cordelia Brenner transferred the entire family trust into a nursing scholarship named the June Ashworth Brenner Scholarship, and she didn't ask Rosie's permission before doing it. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Rosie looked up while she was playing and saw Clayton standing at the far end of the hallway, dressed in his white coat with a patient chart in his hand. He didn't come inside. She didn't stop playing. He stood there until the piece ended, then turned and walked away. He still won. He still had his operating room, still had the Brenner name, and still had a story to tell at the club on Saturday afternoons. Rosie took nothing from him. But the man standing at the end of the hallway, listening to an entire piece of music he hadn't been invited to hear, was a man wondering what he had sold away, and he would ask himself that question far longer than she had ever cried over him. This story reminds us that enduring in silence has never been weakness. But when silence is held for too long, it quietly begins taking away the very people and things that made you who you are. If there is a version of yourself that you folded away and stored somewhere so other people could feel comfortable, open it this weekend, even for only 1 hour. The violin in the closet, the running shoes, the unfinished sketchbook. If you are carrying sacrifices no one has ever thanked you for, buy an inexpensive notebook at the pharmacy and write 2 lines every Sunday evening, one for what you gave away and one for what you finally did for yourself. And if someone you loved left behind a promise, a handwritten recipe, a toolbox, or a photograph tucked inside a drawer at a relative's home, go looking for it this month. A legacy doesn't find its own way to your door. Someone has to go searching for it. If Rosalind Ashworth's story touched something inside you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so you can continue hearing more meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Do you think Rosie did the right thing? Have you ever had to fold away a part of yourself to keep someone else comfortable? Please leave a comment below and tell us everything you are feeling in your heart, because every one of your comments is read and deeply valued by us. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.